The commercialization of genetically modified crops came about in the mid-1990s. At that time, the companies developed two kinds of products that were the mainstay for the whole business. One was insect-resistant crops, and the other was herbicide-resistant crops. The purpose of the insect-resistant crops was to put in the crop something that insects would die if they bit into the crop. And they used toxins from bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, a commonly found bacteria, and they took the gene out of that and put that in the crop. So the insect would bite into any part of the crop, and presumably the toxin would kill the insect, and you wouldn't have to spray the chemicals on the crop. So that was one of the main innovations. The other was to create crops that would tolerate or be resistant to herbicides. The purpose there is typically they would use herbicides before the crop was grown to get rid of the weeds. Weeds compete with the crop for resources. So if you ideally, you want to grow the crop where there are no weeds, so they wouldn't be competing for the resources of the nitrogen of the soil, etc., or even the sun. They would not compete. So if you could get rid of all the weeds and let the crop grow without weeds, there would be no competition. So in order to do this right, and allow the plant to start growing, they would have to spray a herbicide on it that wouldn't kill the crop, but would kill all the weeds. That's the idea. So they figured out how to introduce into the crop a gene and a protein enzymes that would disable the herbicide trying to kill the crop. And the herbicide could then be used when the crop was in development, which couldn't be done before because it would kill the crop. So that was the second major innovation. And those things started to be introduced into commerce in the mid-1990s. And basically, they were for improving production, improving the system of production. So it was for the farmer and, of course, for the people who manufactured the seeds, because they were convincing the farmer that you need our seeds in order to grow a crop and to get a proper yield. Yes, I use the word GMO skeptics as the term that characterizes people who have questions that haven't been answered. They aren't necessarily ideologically opposed to GMOs, but they don't feel comfortable unless some questions can be answered that they feel have not been answered. So for some GMO skeptics, they are not comfortable with the fact that these new crops are introduced without a required risk assessment. And they feel that if you put a chemical into a food product, that there's a requirement that you have to evaluate the chemical to see if the food is now going to be safe. We also have requirements that if you spray herbicides or pesticides on food, that it has to go through a risk assessment by the EPA. Under the federal laws governing pesticides. But in the case of GMOs, the decision was made in the 1990s, and by 1992 was pretty much in place, that if you put a foreign substance into the genome of the plant, if you add a gene into the plant, that's not really considered an additive, not considered an additive. And they declared that any gene entering the plant would be considered generally regarded as safe, which is a technical term. Generally regarded as safe, it means grass. That was introduced into the law for certain types of chemicals. So when the law was passed in 1958, Congress said, oh, well, we want to give certain chemicals a free pass because they've been used for 100 years. So you don't have to put vinegar and go through the testing of vinegar to see if it's safe because, so they call that generally regarded as safe, grass. So here are these foreign substances that were going into crops that the government decided to call generally regarded as safe. And they said, well, we'll allow the corporations who produce the seeds to evaluate them, but we're not going to require that they be evaluated. If they want to consult with us, that's okay. We'll give them our consultation, but they can introduce it onto the marketplace without our evaluation. And I think skeptics are rather concerned about that as a system of protection. The Europeans have a very different system. They require that you have testing for new crops that come into the marketplace. So that's another concern about the skeptics. And also the skeptics feel that if there's going to be public confidence in this technology, that there has to be reputable, independent scientists doing the evaluations. That you don't trust, let's say, Boeing to be the only company to evaluate its planes. You want other people, independent people, to evaluate it. Or you don't want to evaluate automobiles just having the companies do the evaluations. You want to have independent people doing the testing, which we do in this country. Well, most of the evaluations now that have been done in the United States have been done by the companies that produce the seeds. And that concerns a lot of people, what I would consider the skeptics in this. So that gives you an example. And when they do hear about a study that was done, which shows that there might be some adverse effects, they don't understand why the study is left behind, pushed aside, and not really addressed by doing repeated studies or expanding the study, but not just putting it in a drawer saying, oh, this study doesn't mean anything. So that's another area that the skeptics, I think, have concerns over.